Welcome back, everyone. Today's explainer is, well, it's a truly fascinating one. We are diving into some highly unconventional claims from a book published way back in May 2010 by Ryuho Okawa. And here's the hook. It claims to channel the spirit of the legendary economist Adam Smith to offer us a new wealth of nations. Now, whether you approach this as a spiritual text, a provocative thought experiment, or just a unique piece of economic philosophy, our goal today is to impartially unpack exactly what these pages are arguing. So let's jump right in. To really grasp what's going on here, we first need a quick refresher on the man himself. Adam Smith is basically the father of modern economics. He's the mind behind the 18th century classic The Wealth of Nations and that famous concept of the invisible hand, the idea that free markets self-regulate naturally through individual competition. What this specific source material does is take that classical foundation and apply it to modern geopolitical and economic crises. It essentially claims to give us Smith's present-day spiritual perspective on how the world ought to operate right now. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll be covering advocacy of new wealth, defense as a development cost, Marxism and the invisible hand, limits of China's economy, escaping the discount trap, and finally, the path to new economics. Okay, Section 1, Advocacy of New Wealth. Let's look at how this text redefines national prosperity. Right off the bat, the text does something pretty unusual. It intricately links concepts that modern academics usually like to keep in totally separate boxes. I'm talking about national security, diplomatic strategy, and the economic principle of the invisible hand. The author's core premise here is actually quite straightforward. You simply cannot have a functioning, prosperous free market without the physical and geopolitical security there to protect it. It's like trying to build a house without a foundation. Which brings us to Section 2, Defense as a Development Cost. In mainstream debates, we usually hear military spending described as a heavy burden, a massive drain on social resources. But this source completely flips that script. It classifies military expenditure as a cost for development. The argument is that defense isn't a waste. It's a necessary guard, protecting a nation's accumulated wealth and property. Basically, the text argues that having a strong defense is an absolute prerequisite if you want to engage in fair, peaceful international trade. Otherwise, you're just opening yourself up to unfair pressure or outright plunder by hostile nations. And there's a quote in the text that brilliantly sums up this hardline realist stance. It says, "Diplomacy without military power is, in reality, almost powerless." It literally compares conducting diplomacy without military backing to a subordinate nation carrying tribute to a dominant one. Essentially, you're just begging for recognition. It is a very stark view of global economics, asking us to look at modern geopolitical tensions through a deeply pragmatic, almost unforgiving lens. All right, moving into Section 3, Marxism and the invisible hand. We're looking at free markets versus control here. Here's where the source draws a massive line in the sand. On one side, it heavily champions the free market, driven by that invisible hand we talked about. It says the system rewards individual effort and entrepreneurial spirit. Though, and this is crucial, it insists this must operate against a backdrop of strong ethics. On the flip side, the text goes hard after Marxist economics. It argues that rigid state control absolutely crushes human creativity. And even more provocatively, the author claims that Marxism isn't actually based on sound economic logic, but rather on a foundational hatred and deep-seated jealousy of profit and success. So, the main critique the text levels against planned economies is what it calls the illusion of control. It argues that it is just sheer arrogance for any small group of elites to think that human reason alone can perfectly manage a complex, living market. According to the book, the invisible hand represents a higher order, a natural economic balance, and any attempt at top-down planning is just going to disrupt that and inevitably fail. Let's look at Section 4, the limits of China's economy, and why the author believes the bubble will burst. Moving from theory into real-world application, the text aims some incredibly strong warnings directly at China's highly controlled economic model. The author is totally unambiguous here, predicting that China's economic bubble is absolutely going to burst. Why? Well, it points to some very specific structural weaknesses: a severe lack of freedom to acquire information, a heavy reliance on an information police and censorship, and widespread intellectual property theft instead of genuine innovation. Ultimately, the text argues that an autocratic political system is just fundamentally incompatible with running a fully advanced market economy. According to the author's theory, an authoritarian model might actually work fine for rapid early-stage industrialization.
But a massive crisis hits when that nation tries to transition into being a truly advanced economy. To get true innovation and create high-value intellectual property, you absolutely need an open flow of information. Without that freedom, the text argues, the whole system just peaks, stagnates, and eventually collapses in on itself.
Now for Section 5, Escaping the Discount Trap. We are shifting focus to the danger of deflation. So the text doesn't just point fingers outward. It actually has some extremely sharp criticisms for Japan's own domestic economic strategies. It uses this highly specific, super bold phrase, Uniqlo ruining the nation. Now, the author clarifies they aren't just attacking one single company. Instead, it's a harsh condemnation of a broader corporate strategy, the kind that relies entirely on cheap overseas labor to fuel a relentless race to the absolute lowest retail prices back home. The text views this obsession with extreme cheapness as a literal fast track to national economic ruin. And the text lays out exactly how this deflationary death spiral works. Step 1. Relentless discount wars kick off. Step 2. This extreme downward price pressure absolutely crushes domestic industries and local competitors who just can't match those overseas labor costs. And finally, Step 3. The nation totally loses its foundational wealth and productive capacity, downgrading into a second-rate economy that's entirely reliant on cheap imports. To escape this trap, the book argues a nation has to pivot back to high-value-added production and real innovation. And finally, Section 6, The Path to New Economics. It's all about fusing markets and ethics. This is where all these complex threads finally come together. The text culminates by proposing what it calls a new economics. But this isn't unbridled cutthroat capitalism, and it certainly isn't oppressive state control. Instead, it's a system that explicitly fuses pure free market principles with religious ethics and really strong moral foundations. The author's point is that the invisible hand works best, and honestly, maybe only works in the long term, when the people competing in that market are guided by a strong ethical compass. That's what prevents capitalism from devolving into unethical predatory practices while still completely rejecting Marxist suppression. And that leaves us with the core thesis of this whole source material. In an era completely defined by global uncertainty, rapid deflation, and these massive ideological clashes between free and controlled markets, does modern economics actually require a return to moral and religious ethics to survive? It is a super heavy question, and it really challenges those traditional boundaries between spirituality and commerce. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the economic frameworks around you, and we'll catch you next time.